demanding a zero waste, zero carbon, zero hunger university. And we've made some progress. They've been responsive, including our food sovereignty center, our garden rollout, and things like that. But we also felt we needed to give momentum to that. And again, using limited resources, we felt that with the presence of activists here in Johannesburg, we give a big push to divestment and so on, and hand over a memorandum to the university. So we wanted to use WITS as a trigger for what could happen at Stellenbosch, what could happen at University of Free State, what could happen at Nelson Mandela Metro, etc., etc. So we wanted to use that engagement to move things forward in a very practical way. WITS has agreed to accept our memorandum. We've done a lot of groundwork on this through the WhatsApp groups to get endorsements, etc. We have several organizations now that have endorsed the demands. But Courtney will speak to that a little bit more. But given the contingencies that we're going to manage, so WITS is shut down today, okay? It might reopen tomorrow, it may stay closed. There's a lot of uncertainty here. But the tactic of going to gather in front of our Great Hall, one of our deputy vice-chancellors coming to meet us to get this, etc., I'd like us to discuss. That's something we can still do, and again do it in a disciplined way, displaying a different ethics of care, COVID activism, if you like, okay? Where we go, we stand, in distance. We have a responsibility, comrades, to raise consciousness. And so how we conduct ourselves is very, very important.
Nice new term, COVID.
Not covert, COVID.
And COVID.
And COVID too. A little bit of that. So we could still do that, and that would mean me then, after we deliberate on this, informing the management, we coming onto campus, etc. Okay? Quincy, unfortunately, you won't be able to join us because the university has restricted any international visitors from being at the university, for example. Okay? So there's all those little things we're going to have to navigate. If you don't want to do that, and I don't want to preempt the debate when Courtney presents and so on, we can just email them. But then again, as activists, here's a moment, here's an opportunity, we have some resources, there'll be some students at WITS that will be willing to join us and things like that. The idea was to actually have a march from one end of the campus, even all of us in a disciplined line. We have posters, we have banners, we walk from one end of the campus to the Great Hall, stand there in a line, management comes, we give, and hopefully there'll be some conversation. I've asked them to say a few words. We want them to transition to renewable energy, and we want them to tell us our plans, and so on. And so that, the strategic idea behind this, comrades, is that if we can push big institutions in our society, like universities, we have 37,000 people at WITS, that can display climate justice leadership, transition to renewable energy, the zero hunger stuff, public transport, etc., we can shift 26 other institutions in the country. That is a major climate justice shift in South African politics. Universities will be showing a symbolic and a powerful example to the rest of the country. So I'm just going to leave you with that. It'll percolate, it'll ferment. Courtney will bring us back to this issue. Just the point about Quincy. So we were going to have a big event at WITS, and we had lots of confirmations, comrades, for people coming to hear you present Quincy. But given the dynamics at WITS, we've cancelled it. But we are going to record your talk, and we're going to make it available on social media and things like that. Okay. So I just need you to understand that.
No, it's fine.
And then, of course, as I said, we're going to be kind of Skyping in other activists who are central to a lot of the sort of thematic focus on this program. Comrades, can we move on? Okay? All right. So the first kind of deliberation we want to have is around taking stock of where the Climate Justice Charter has gone to, the dialogue. Where has it traveled to, and things like that. We also want to get a gauge in this meeting of Climate Justice Charter network building, movement building, and is there any kind of progress on this front? But again, as activists, we are alive to change. The world is in a constant state of change. Okay? And particularly in the world we are living in, there are going to be all kinds of contingencies. And so the COVID-19 thing, which we've already kind of flagged, is here. It's arrived in South Africa. And it's something that we have to bring into our activism. And I'm going to increasingly talk about how we connect these things as we go forward. In a way, as I said, the declaration of a national disaster around COVID-19 is actually a dress rehearsal. Because when you really think through climate change and climate crisis, well, when food systems collapse at 3 degrees and 4 degrees Celsius, not just here, in many parts of the world, when water systems collapse because of droughts, etc., in many parts of the world, okay, you're talking about global scale shocks here. These are shocks that are very similar to COVID-19. Okay? Governments are going to have to step in together with citizens to deal with these situations. You are going to see immense danger and possibilities of harm to societies. We are going to see increasingly stressed socio-ecological systems and institutions. We are going to see collapsing socio-ecological orders. It's already begun in places like Mozambique and in Zimbabwe and so on. Okay? They are not going to be able to bounce back after these things because we are starting from a very weak institutional base. Okay? COVID-19 is going to test all social orders on planet Earth, all societies. Okay? And you're going to see the weaknesses coming out already. Okay? So in a sense, it's a dress rehearsal, and actually it's an opportunity for us as climate justice forces to really ensure that certain thrusts that come through in COVID-19 are also thrusts that help us shift our societies onto a just transition trajectory. That's the strategic issue, okay? In the responsiveness we're getting from state, in the responsiveness we're getting from capital, in the responsiveness we're getting from trade unions and other social forces, the thrusts that come through to cushion our society, to protect our society, how do we get those thrusts to actually reinforce the just transition? So, I started off our conversation just giving a bit of background to the Climate Justice Charter process, but there are other important markers that we need to kind of take on board as well. The Australian fires were some of the worst fires in the history of Australia. Okay, millions of species completely burnt to death. It was ecocidal. They have a conservative government and a prime minister who's very pro-coal in Australia, and that is shifting a whole set of dynamics inside Australia. And clearly there's a breakthrough happening because of climate shocks in Australia. So despite the power structure, despite the politicians, this fire has opened up a whole different conversation in Australia. Okay? The destruction of the Amazon is ongoing, and many of us have been kind of tuned in to the Bolsonaro regime, which is also a carbon capitalist regime, and which is very racist, and which has been basically attempting a land grab on a dramatic scale in the Amazon. And fires have been set up, etc., by mining interests, by timber interests, by farming interests, and they are continuing a colonial genocide against the Amazonian peoples. And that destruction is ongoing. He has given further sort of effort to this. There are laws, etc., being debated around the Amazon, etc., in the Brazilian parliament. But at the same time, there's resistance from indigenous communities. This is resistance that we always got to keep in mind for where we are in history today. Very similar to what's happening in Canada. I really can't pronounce the word of the indigenous community. I think that, how do you say it? Quincy, do you know?
I don't want to risk.
Sweat,
Sweat.
something, but it's really beautiful. But the point is this, is that that community is at the front line of anti-extractivism and pipeline building and so on over indigenous land, etc. So the last great dispossession of our commons that's happening is the continuity of colonial dispossession, and indigenous peoples are fighting some of these battles to defend life. The Arctic is melting 6 times faster than scientists have predicted. This is the recent climate science, okay? Which means that this is another canary in the mine, comrades, okay? And all the data, the past 10 years on record have been the hottest years on record on planet Earth, okay? All the indexes and indicators are just like flashing, okay? All the tipping points are flashing right now, okay? And then, of course, we have Trump in the White House, an eco-fascist, okay, who's completely about reproducing carbon capitalism at all costs, okay? He doesn't care about any one of us, including the American people, ironically, okay? And there have been massive shocks inside the United States. In the recent polls that have been taken, over 70% of Americans are concerned at a personal level about climate. This was never the case 5 years ago. This was never the case 10 years ago. This wasn't the case 15 years ago, because fossil fuel corporations were able to muddle and confuse the debate and the policy question in the United States on climate. But there's a shift happening, and it's got to do with climate shocks. The election that is looming this year, which is going to be a very, very important election, it is a climate election. Bernie Sanders has the most advanced climate plan on planet Earth right now, and I've read it, all 60-odd pages of it, okay? And it is about decarbonizing the US military, for example. It is about a massive reduction and phase out of fossil fuels and carbon reductions, etc. And it's also very heartbreaking when you look at what's happening inside the Democratic Party elections and primaries, but there's all kinds of narratives. But anyway, it's important for us to feature that in this conversation, that we are entering a period of climate elections in the world, okay? It's a pity that Coburn lost in the UK, because Coburn's platform was a eco-socialist platform, actually, on climate. Okay. The drought in South Africa is continuing, comrades. It's continuing. And we have comrades and activists from the front line of this drought that are bearing the brunt. They are coming from communities where there is still no or limited water. And we really got to think about how do we connect up this climate shock to our activism this year. One of the ideas for us that we've been circulating and thinking with other activists around is save our souls, comrades. Hashtag SOS. No water. Okay? No water to wash our hands now. No water to keep ourselves clean in the context of COVID and so on and so on. But this is connecting climate and COVID in practice. Okay? So how do we message the narrative out of our school around the ongoing drought that speaks to the new developments in the country, including COVID? This is very, very important. There's an opportunity here. The drought has been breaking in different parts of the country because of rainfall. But again, I know Cape Town dam levels are not completely out of the danger zone, Zelda, from what I know, but maybe things are changing. I visited Graaf-Reinet a few months ago, and the dam was just bone dry. It was just unbelievable. But Chris John was Skyped in, and she'll give us a sense of where things are at. The UN process, comrades, around the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, none of us in this room have illusions about the Paris Climate Agreement. We all share a common critique of this agreement. It locks in marketized solutions. It is not enough. It does not regulate reductions. It's not about the phase out of fossil fuels. It's about bringing down emissions, which means it doesn't have the fossil fuel corporations at the center of what needs to happen. the airline industry, the shipping industry, and hence it wants to work via nation states to try and solve this problem. There's also historical issues here around emissions, and the principle of common but differentiated responsibility is quite farcical with the Paris Climate ratchet up mechanism, etc. And essentially it's floundering. So Trump has pulled out, one of the major emitters on planet Earth, albeit eclipsed now by China in terms of aggregate emissions. And so it's creating, again, a very dangerous situation in terms of global climate politics. On February 9th, all governments on planet Earth that are signatories to the Paris Climate Agreement were meant to lodge their ambitious climate plans with the UN. And most governments have not done that. Okay? And including this one, the carbon criminal state of South Africa. Okay? So basically the Paris Climate Agreement is really not gaining traction on the ground in societies. Okay? And again, this is something we need to spotlight in our activism as well. We have a new Minister of the Environment. She's been having consultations and dialogues, and some of our activists have gone into those processes, not blindly, not to surrender our agency to this minister, but to engage critically. And some of the children, the child activists that we've been working with also went to some of these engagements, and they were treated in a very horrible way. Okay? So there's a minister here who is wanting to talk climate, but in the context of a government that is locked into a coal-heavy national energy mix. We have a minerals and energy minister who is very pro-carbon, including clean coal and all kinds of other techno fixes. We even have chatter and talk about nuclear coming back and so on. So there's all kinds of things, contradictions in the state that are there. We also have the Eskom crisis at the heart of our South African crisis. I'm not going to belabor this point, but just to signal that it's a multifaceted, complex crisis, and that it is at the heart also of the just transition that we need in South Africa. And it's something we have to grapple with. But it would seem that the urgency around the rolling blackouts, the institutional failures of Eskom, etc., despite the state prompting a response around renewable energy, etc. It may not be the kind of transition we want. It may not be socially owned and community-owned renewable energy. But corporations want to defend profit rates, electricity prices are going up, etc., and they are taking the initiative now to transition to renewables. Some of them, not all of them. Okay? But where does this leave communities that also want to make this transition? And there's a gap there. The state has not risen using the Eskom crisis to articulate a clear, just transition plan. Okay? And that's a bit of an impasse, and these are things we can reflect on together. Now, COVID-19 emerged recently from China. It is a world pandemic, according to the World Health Organization. It's the first time in 100 years that we have such a rapid spread of a dangerous virus on planet Earth. All the numbers are there. This is not the typical infection rates of a flu. It's completely surpassed that. The mortality rates are also speaking for themselves. It has ravaged affluent societies, relatively affluent societies, China, Italy. Germany is rapidly becoming a hotspot right now. It's interesting the responses that we are seeing. In some places we are seeing xenophobia, we are seeing racism, we are seeing the shutting of borders, etc. for those reasons, okay? Because of exclusionary nationalisms. On the other hand, we are seeing people shutting borders because it's a scientific response and things like that. But we've seen coming out of the United States the declaration of an emergency, but what we've seen full-blown in a market democracy is plutocratic power. Trump announced his emergency together with the CEO of various pharmaceutical corporations, retail corporations, and essentially has privatized the response to COVID-19 in the United States. Yes, state agencies will play a role and are playing a role in the United States, but essentially the 50 billion that he was declaring for resourcing of the crisis is privatizing the crisis.
Yeah.
And we have to keep that in perspective in relation to what was announced last night in South Africa. The state is still in the driving seat, but of course we have a neo-corporatist arrangement in South Africa, and particularly the details around the macroeconomic dimension and response to the crisis is going to be worked out in NEDLAC in consultation with capital and labor, etc. And so again, and you know what, NEDLAC is a very weak institution because unions are very weak. Capital is racially divided in South Africa. And we have a precariat working class in South Africa. So we have large swathes of our population that's unemployed that will not have a voice in NEDLAC, in whatever consensus is built there. So it's not going to be an inclusive consensus if that's going to be the modality of coming to a set of propositions around an economic policy response to COVID. So we have a different dynamic here in terms of how the state is responding, but the state has stepped up. It has placed itself in the driving seat. You're going to have this command structure meeting 3 times a week, and you're going to see an interministerial response to this, and so on. Sorry. So, what are the similarities here around COVID and the climate crisis? And I really want to kind of theoretically kind of bring these things together to reinforce this idea that COVID, activism around COVID justice is also activism around climate justice. These things are connected. So, if you look at COVID-19, it really comes from the destruction of nature. Okay? So, from the research that has been done around what is called ground zero for COVID-19, pangolins seem to be sitting at the heart of this. An exotic, beautiful creature that is endangered. But of course, there's an appetite for these creatures. There's also an appetite for our rhinos and other exotic creatures in a particular kind of market in China, a food market. And in a sense, this is an elite diet. Okay, because these animals fetch a very high price on these markets. All right. COVID-19 came to South Africa because of rich people going skiing in Italy. Okay, because people who are on these globalized cultural circuits, etc. Okay, so COVID-19 actually, if you look at it in political economy terms, is a rich person's disease. Okay, and that's how it's spreading. Okay. That doesn't mean it's going to stop there. That's the damn problem with this thing. Similarly, with if you look at the climate problem, it's got to do with 150 years of industrial carbon-based capitalism led by the rich countries, okay, who are refusing to take responsibility for this problem, okay. But in the end, I think what's shared in common is the revenge of nature, okay. I hate to use this phrase because there's a lot of harm that is coming with this. But it is true. Okay? The raw power of nature is being unleashed. Okay? We are abusing it, we are destroying it, we are exploiting it, etc. And it's coming back. There are consequences to our actions. And there are consequences to a political economy that ravages nature. A capitalist political economy. Okay? And there's a failure to accept limits. There's a failure to accept that there are cycles in natural systems that have to be respected. And capitalism doesn't respect that. It works with the assumption of endless accumulation at all costs. It will externalize the costs of nature. Okay? And it will continue. I mean, it has a closed, reified logic. That's how it works. Okay? So, there are similarities here that we cannot ignore. The second point to make is about the scale of the problem. The scale of the problem is massive. Okay, we're just seeing it. It's just unfolded over the past 2-3 months in front of all of us around COVID. It requires societies to be placed on an emergency footing to deal with the harm, the threats, the dangers. It's as simple as that. Okay? And we've seen how governments have responded. Okay? China being an authoritarian state, locked down Wuhan, but it's not just Wuhan. There are 6 other states, by the way. The news only focuses on Wuhan. Okay? We still don't know what's happening in those other states, by the way. Okay? But the Chinese economic juggernaut and the Communist Party want to get the dynamo of accumulation going again. And of course, they've done certain things, which we cannot deny, okay, and which we can see, all right? And they have brought down rates of infection and things like that. But it does require intervention. That was an authoritarian response. In Italy, we are seeing a particular kind of response in a democracy. But they are locking down the entire society. They are, if you like, managing public spaces, similar to what we are trying to do. So sports games, things like, they went further than us. Okay, football games, all of those things have been cancelled and things, so people don't interact and people don't get infected, etc., etc. Okay, we've seen what happened in the United States with the particular privatized approach to this emergency and disaster. But we are also seeing a lot of panic. We are seeing a lot of fear. We are seeing a lot of hoarding behavior and so on. Okay, happening in certain parts of the world and in certain societies. But the point of the matter is that you require a societal response. You require it for COVID. You require it for the climate crisis. Okay. Now, our government has triggered the Disaster Management Act, as I've underlined. As activists, we need to look at this thing because it was never effective in the context of the drought, and we've had a critique of it. Okay? The drought response in this country was useless. Okay? People have suffered. The drought was only declared in the February of 2018 as a national disaster. Okay? 3-4 years into this drought. Okay? And we had this Disaster Management Act. One of my colleagues at WITS worked on it years ago. Colleen Vogel, who's a leading climate scientist. And she was very disheartened that this wasn't, and she came into conversation with us in this process. This was never triggered. But now the president is leaning on the Disaster Management Act. It's part of our democracy, it's a legislation. Is it up to the task? And it wasn't up to the task during the drought. And it's something we need to think about. Okay? And we need to engage with this thing. There's also a bit of a top-down rationality that comes with declaring disasters and emergencies. It limits the role of citizens' engagement. As I said, government is using NEDLAC, so it's bringing in social partners. But where communities, where grassroots forces, we need to be grappling with this. The other thing about the similarities between COVID and climate crisis is the harm. And the harm is big. Okay? And the harm is disastrous for the vulnerable who have not created the problem. Okay. So, poor working class communities in South Africa didn't go skiing. They can't. Okay. Similarly, poor working class communities, most of whom don't have energy, because there's energy inequality in this country, have not created the climate problem. Okay. So there's injustice. So those that are least responsible for the problem are going to bear the brunt the most. There's disproportionality here, both with COVID, and there's going to be and there has been disproportionality with climate shocks already in South Africa. Okay, so they share something in common here, and that means we've got to confront the injustices of COVID-19, and we've got to confront the injustices of climate crisis. Okay, consistently as activists. And I did say that those communities that don't have water infrastructure, sanitation infrastructure, that don't have access to food, food inequality is a big problem in this country. 54% of our population was food insecure before the drought. And I can tell you from our activism and our drought speak-outs, our hunger tribunals, we heard horror stories over the past 5 years. Okay. There have been horror stories coming out of places like Cape Town, Graaff-Reinet, and many other smaller towns, Nosinto's village, etc., around the crises that are ravaging these communities. There's a need for resistance in this context, okay? And we've got to think about resistance that is transformative. That is a resistance that is about systemic transformation. We are not going to manage the disaster moment in South Africa without dealing deeply with the causality issues. Where do the problems lie? What are the consequences? Etc., etc. Similarly, with climate, we're going to need democratic systemic reforms. We're going to have to change the entire system. We're going to have a new energy system. We call it socially owned renewable energy. We're going to need a new food system. We call it food sovereignty, etc., etc. So, as I said, I mean, one of the things we want to talk to here also is the Climate Justice Charter. We've given a lot of background to this already. It comes out of our 5 years of campaigning, a water conference we had a few years ago. It comes out of roundtable discussions last year. It comes out of public engagements. We have now put the Climate Justice Charter online, and I'll say more about that just now. We've had think pieces that also helped us frame the charter. We had commissioned think pieces from numerous activists in different movements to write for us, etc. Sorry. Sorry. So the charter, I'm not going to get into it. I hope most of you have read it, but it sets out a preamble. It's not a typical charter that is just about principles, like the Freedom Charter. Okay, this charter is a bit more comprehensive as a text. It has a preamble which sets out a set of goals. It sets out principles for the deep, just transition that have come out of our movements. It sets out systemic alternatives for the transition. And it talks about a climate justice state. We don't want a climate emergency state that can use a state of exception to become authoritarian. Okay? We want a climate justice state that will deepen democracy, that will strengthen the voice and the role of citizens to lead the transition. We also want a decarbonized state, okay, to lead this transition, etc. I'm not going to spend too much of time on this, but just to say that the chart is there. What's happening here? Okay, no, I'm going back. Okay, as I said, in the context of what we've been doing while we are kind of trying to get the charter to the ground, deepen the conversations, take it to communities, workplaces, and so on, into our movements and organizations, we're also trying to build in the context of resistance and struggle. And these are the principles that we came up with guiding sort of climate justice movement building. Unite and build convergences, commit to the Climate Justice Charter, vision, goals and practices, actively struggle for decarbonization of our society, advance systemic alternatives, ensure community and workplace participation, democratize science, affirm respect, practice collective, radical non-racialism and gender-conscious leadership, and democratic deliberation. So these are principles that are like a compass for how we should conduct ourselves. These are guidelines for our activism, and these are all subject to being tested in practice, so that by the time we go to the week of action in October in Cape Town, we have some kind of consensus on this, and we firm up these principles, and we launch the Climate Justice Charter movement, alliance, network, whatever you want to call it, and we take it from there. And then, of course, the COVID issue, which I've been pulling through, requires a response from us as climate justice forces. And yesterday I was on WhatsApp talking to various groups, including labor groups, journalists. I even was talking to Natalia, a comrade many of you know, who's a doctor, having a debate with her. What kind of response should we have as a platform? A people's response to COVID-19. And I put some of this out on WhatsApp as well. And this was before the president's speech, so, you know, a lot has changed in the past few hours. But we need to also put out a public statement on this. And coming out of this activist school, in the next 24 hours, with your input and your engagement, we will be putting out a climate justice charter platform statement on this issue. So your feedback, etc., is going to be very, very important. We want to speak to the ongoing challenges. We want to speak to the gaps. We want to speak to the limits of what the state is doing, while embracing the good stuff. There's some good stuff there, and we don't come off as, people who are just rejectionist and negative, etc. We do need a national response. We all have to play our part at this point in time. But again, it's not as though it can just be state-led. We have got to play our part in this process, and so how we position is very careful, is important. Finally, comrades, just to wrap up, so how do we link COVID-19 and climate crisis in our activism? So let's talk about that. What constraints and limits does COVID-19 bring to our activism? What should be the content for people's response to COVID-19? What kind of engagements have we done on the ground and online to promote the draft Climate Justice Charter? As I've been arguing, promoting the Charter is also promoting a response to COVID-19, comrades. These things are not separate, okay? If we can get the systemic change thrust coming out of COVID-19 and we can reinforce it with the Climate Justice Charter, plus we deepen those systemic changes through the Charter, we are heading towards a country that is committed to a climate just approach to climate. What feedback are we getting on the Charter? So we really want to hear from you. Is there, and we don't want we know we got to translate it, we know we got to simplify language, and all of those kinds of things, but we want some substantive feedback. How do we build a Climate Justice Charter network in practice from below? So, comrades, I'm going to end there. So this was just to stimulate a conversation so that we get up to speed and we're able to kind of connect these issues and to talk to where the Charter process is. It is also a Google Doc. I forgot, I did mention that, and we've been getting comments from different individuals in society. It's traveled on all kinds of Facebook pages, etc. So it's out there. It's in the national conversation. It is part of the imaginary around climate justice. But we need, in our narrative coming out of this activist school, to affirm it as a response also to COVID-19. It's open for comment and engagement.